Millionaire CEO left his sick black wife. 18 years later, he saw her daughter as a rising business star. But Richard only saw her face. Monica's face. The same high cheekbones, the same determined jaw, the same fire in her dark eyes when she believed in something. His daughter had inherited her mother's passion and, God help them all, his own ruthless intelligence. Have you ever seen someone who made you stop breathing, not from attraction, but from recognition of something you thought you'd lost forever? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. She commanded the stage like she owned the world, until the moment her eyes locked with the man who had abandoned her mother 18 years ago, though she didn't know it yet. The New York Tech Summit buzzed with 5,000 industry leaders, but Layla Johnson made them all disappear with her first words. At 26, she stood behind that podium like she'd been born for it. Her burgundy blazer caught the spotlight as she gripped the microphone, and every person in that massive convention center leaned forward. Corporate empires built on exploitation don't just hurt communities, she began, her voice carrying to the back rows without strain. They destroy families. They rob children of their futures. And today, I'm here to tell you that some of those empires deserve to fall. The crowd erupted. Phones came out. Social media exploded. But in the VIP section, one man sat frozen like he'd seen a ghost. Richard Collins gripped his whiskey glass so tight his knuckles went white. 18 years. 18 years since he'd walked away from Atlanta, from his marriage, from responsibilities he couldn't handle. And now his daughter, his brilliant, fierce daughter, stood on that stage declaring war on everything he'd built. She didn't know. How could she know? Monica had told the world he was dead. Have you ever felt the electricity of someone watching you, even in a crowd of thousands? That moment when your skin prickles and you know, absolutely know, someone's eyes are burning into you? That's what hit Layla as she reached the climax of her presentation. My new venture, Justice Tech, will specifically target corporations that prioritize profit over people. We're not just disrupting industries. We're dismantling the systems that allow powerful men to abandon their responsibilities while communities suffer. Richard's chest tightened. Every word felt aimed directly at him, though she couldn't possibly know who he was. Could she? Layla's presentation slides showed homeless families, medical bankruptcies, communities destroyed by corporate greed. Images that made Richard's throat close up because he recognized the story behind them, a story he'd helped write when he chose business over family. These aren't just statistics, Layla continued, her voice getting stronger. This is about mothers working 3 jobs to pay for medicine they can't afford. This is about children growing up without fathers because those men decided success mattered more than love. The words hit Richard like physical blows. She was talking about Monica, about herself, about him. The audience was on their feet now, applauding and cheering. Layla's presentation had gone viral before she'd even finished speaking. Tech blogs were already calling it the most powerful keynote in Summit history. But Richard only saw her face. Monica's face. The same high cheekbones, the same determined jaw, the same fire in her dark eyes when she believed in something. His daughter had inherited her mother's passion and, God help them all, his own ruthless intelligence. Justice Tech launches next month, Layla announced, her smile sharp as a blade. And we're coming for every corrupt empire that thinks money can buy silence. Some of you in this audience know exactly who you are. Her gaze swept the VIP section. For one heart-stopping moment, her eyes met Richard's across that vast space. Time stopped. His breath caught. Did she recognize him? Or was he just another target in her crosshairs? The moment stretched like pulled wire, then snapped as applause thundered through the convention center. Layla smiled, a warrior smile, and walked off stage like she'd just declared victory in a war Richard didn't even know had started. Have you ever seen someone who made you stop breathing, not from attraction, but from recognition of something you thought you'd lost forever? That's what Richard felt as he watched his daughter disappear behind the curtain. Pride and terror crashed together in his chest like opposing storms. She was magnificent, powerful, brilliant, Everything he'd hoped she'd become, and everything he'd feared she'd become. Because women like that, women with Monica's heart in his mind, they were dangerous. They were unstoppable, and she was coming for him. Richard's phone buzzed with messages from his board, his investors, his lawyers. Everyone wanted to know if he'd heard Layla Johnson's presentation, if he understood what Justice Tech meant for companies like Collins Industries. He understood perfectly. His daughter, the daughter who thought he was dead, had just declared war on his empire. And the most terrifying part? She had the skills to win. As the crowd filed out of the convention center, Richard sat alone in the VIP section, staring at the empty stage where his daughter had just changed both their lives forever. 18 years of guilt, 18 years of wondering what had become of the family he'd abandoned, and now he knew. They become his reckoning. What happens when your greatest triumph becomes someone else's worst nightmare? What happens when the child you failed grows up to be everything you admired and everything you feared? As she concluded with "Some empires deserve to fall," her gaze swept the VIP section and lingered, just for a heartbeat, on Richard's face. Did she recognize him, or was he just another target in her crosshairs? He hired the best private investigator in New York not to destroy her, but to learn about the daughter he'd lost, only to discover she was more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Richard's penthouse office overlooked Central Park, but he hadn't seen the view in 3 days. His laptop screen showed the same Forbes article he'd read 50 times. Layla Johnson, the 26-year-old CEO taking down corporate America. Her photo stared back at him. Professional headshot, confident smile, eyes that held secrets he desperately needed to understand. Monica's eyes. The private investigator's report landed on his desk with a thick thud. 200 pages of his daughter's life, compiled by the best firm money could buy. Richard's hands shook as he opened it. Subject: Layla Marie Johnson. Born: Atlanta, Georgia. Father: listed as deceased, car accident victim. His heart stopped. Deceased. Monica had told their daughter he was dead. The investigator had been thorough. Bank records, school transcripts, business filings, social media posts going back years. Richard devoured every detail like a starving man. Layla had graduated valedictorian from Johns Hopkins. Full scholarship, business degree with honors. She'd started her first company at 22, sold it for $30 million at 24, and now Justice Tech was valued at over $200 million. Remarkable trajectory, the report noted. Subject: displays unusual combination of ethical leadership and ruthless business acumen. Ruthless business acumen. Richard's throat tightened. She'd inherited that from him. He flipped through pages of photographs. Layla at business conferences, charity galas, community events. Always professional, always in control. But Richard's trained eye caught what others missed. The way she held herself slightly apart, the practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was lonely, successful beyond measure, but lonely. The report detailed her romantic history. Brief relationships with fellow entrepreneurs, tech executives, venture capitalists. Nothing serious, nothing lasting. Subject appears to prioritize career advancement over personal relationships, the investigator noted. Multiple sources describe her as driven to the point of isolation. Richard recognized that pattern. He'd lived it himself, choosing ambition over love, success over family. The apple hadn't fallen far from the tree. Then he reached the section about Monica, and his world collapsed. Subject's mother, Monica Johnson, died 2 years ago from lupus-related complications. Subject was primary caregiver during final illness. Medical bills exceeded $500,000. Subject liquidated personal assets to ensure mother received best possible care. The words blurred as Richard's eyes filled. Monica was gone. The woman he'd loved and abandoned was gone, and their daughter had fought alone to save her. $500,000. The amount that had destroyed Monica's life, that had forced their daughter to sacrifice everything, that Richard could have paid without blinking. His phone rang. Board meeting in an hour. Crisis management session about Justice Tech's threat to their business model. His executives wanted strategies to neutralize Layla Johnson's campaign. They had no idea they were asking him to destroy his own daughter. Richard closed the investigator's report and stared out at Central Park. Families walked the paths below, fathers pushing strollers, mothers holding children's hands, couples sharing ice cream. Normal people living normal lives, loving the people they were supposed to love. What would you do if you found out your child had become everything you admired, but also your biggest threat? What would you do if success meant destroying the family you'd already failed once? He thought about Monica's funeral. The report included news clippings, photos of a modest service in Baltimore. Layla standing alone at the graveside, no other family members listed. She'd buried her mother by herself while Richard built his empire in Manhattan, completely unaware. The guilt was crushing, not just for leaving. He'd carried that weight for 18 years. But for missing Monica's death, for not knowing his daughter needed help, for being so focused on his own life that he'd lost track of theirs completely. His assistant knocked. "Mr. Collins? The board is ready for you." Richard straightened his tie and walked toward the boardroom, where 15 executives waited to plan Layla's professional destruction. They saw her as a threat to their quarterly profits. He saw her as the only family he had left. The conference room fell silent as he entered. Charts and graphs covered the walls. Analysis of Justice Tech's business model, projections of their potential impact on Collins Industries, strategies for corporate warfare. "Sir," his CFO began, "we've identified several pressure points. Johnson's company is vulnerable to patent challenges, regulatory complaints, and targeted investor relations campaigns." Richard nodded, playing his role, but his mind was elsewhere, calculating different numbers. How much would it cost to disappear? To liquidate his assets quietly and leave Layla to her mission? "There's another option," his head of security said quietly. "Personal leverage. Johnson has some interesting vulnerabilities in her background, such as her mother's medical situation, some questionable financial decisions during the illness. We could frame it as healthcare fraud, force Johnson to focus on legal defense instead of attacking us." The room went dead silent. Richard's hands clenched under the conference table. They wanted to use Monica's suffering against their daughter. "Gentlemen," Richard said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I want to be very clear about something. Layla Johnson's personal life is off limits. Completely off limits. Anyone who suggests otherwise will be looking for new employment." His executives exchanged confused glances. Richard Collins didn't usually show mercy to business threats, but they didn't know they were talking about his daughter. Like and subscribe if this story has you hooked. Have you ever been in a situation where protecting someone meant going against everything you built? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The meeting ended with half measures and defensive strategies. As his executives filed out, Richard stayed behind, staring at the whiteboard covered with plans to neutralize Justice Tech. His phone buzzed. Text message from unknown number. "Mr. Collins. This is Layla Johnson. I believe we should meet. Today, 6 p.m. The address is attached. Come alone." Richard's blood turned to ice. Somehow, his daughter had found him first. The private investigator's final report landed on his desk with one detail that changed everything. Layla's new venture wasn't just targeting corrupt corporations. It was specifically designed to destroy Collins Industries. She walked into his corporate headquarters like a conquering queen, there to deliver terms of surrender he couldn't possibly accept. The elevator to the 52nd floor had never felt so slow. Richard checked his reflection in the polished steel doors, straightening a tie that didn't need straightening, running hands through hair that was already perfect. He was about to meet his daughter, really meet her, not as the distant figure on a stage, but face to face in his own boardroom. The irony wasn't lost on him. She was coming to his territory, but somehow he felt like the one walking into a trap. The elevator chimed. Doors opened, and there she stood. Layla Johnson commanded attention the way some people commanded armies. Effortlessly, absolutely, without question. Her charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, her posture confident, her handshake firm when Richard's assistant introduced them. "Mr. Collins," she said, and hearing his name in her voice. Monica's voice, but stronger, nearly broke him. "Ms. Johnson, thank you for coming." She followed him into the boardroom, her heels clicking against marble floors that had cost more than most people's houses. The space was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, a conference table that could seat 30, artwork worth millions. Layla wasn't intimidated. She set her briefcase on the table like she owned the place. "Impressive office," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't impressed at all. "I can see why you'd want to protect this." Richard gestured to a chair. She sat with fluid grace, crossing her legs and opening her briefcase with practiced efficiency. Everything about her screamed competence and control. "I assume you know why I'm here," she said, pulling out a thick folder. "Justice Tech wants to acquire our ethical technology division. Justice Tech wants to prevent Collins Industries from continuing to profit off human suffering." Her eyes met his across the polished table. "The acquisition is just the civilized way to do it. Have you ever been in a room with someone where the air felt electric, but you couldn't understand why?" That's what Richard experienced as his daughter laid out her proposal. Every gesture was familiar. The way she tilted her head when making a point, the way her fingers drummed against the table when thinking. Monica used to do the same things. "Your company has spent 20 years building market dominance through regulatory capture and community exploitation," Layla continued, her voice steady as a surgeon's blade. "Atlanta, Birmingham, Memphis, you've left a trail of bankrupted families and destroyed neighborhoods." Each city name hit Richard like a physical blow. She wasn't just talking about business practices. She was talking about what happened to her mother. "Ms. Johnson," he said carefully, "Collins Industries operates within all legal parameters. Legal and ethical aren't the same thing." She leaned forward, and Richard caught her scent, something clean and professional with an undertone of steel. "You know that better than most." Did she know? The question hammered in his mind as she spread financial documents across the table. Her research was flawless, her arguments devastating, her presentation ruthlessly professional. But there was something else. The way she watched him, like she was studying his reactions. The way she paused after certain phrases, as if testing how they landed. "Your proposed acquisition terms are generous," Richard said, reviewing her offer. "Almost suspiciously generous. I prefer to think of it as thorough." Her smile was sharp as winter wind. "Collins Industries has value beyond its current leadership. Under proper management, your technology division could actually help people instead of exploiting them." Under proper management. The insult was wrapped in silk, but it was still an insult. Richard found himself studying her face, looking for traces of himself in her features. The stubborn set of her jaw when she was determined. That was his. The way she calculated responses before speaking, definitely his. But the fire in her eyes, the passionate conviction in her voice when she talked about justice, that was pure Monica. "What makes you think I'd sell to you?" he asked. "Because you're not stupid." She pulled out another document. "This is a preliminary injunction we're filing Monday. Patent challenges, regulatory complaints, and a very public investigation into Collins Industries' community impact practices." Richard's blood chilled as he read. She'd found everything. Every shortcut his company had taken, every regulatory loophole they'd exploited, every community they'd impacted without adequate compensation. She had enough evidence to bury him. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been motivated." There was something personal in her tone now, something that went beyond business. Some of us understand what it's like when powerful men decide profit matters more than people. The accusation hung in the air between them like a charged wire. Richard felt sweat building under his collar despite the air conditioning. Share your most intense first meeting story. Have you ever walked into a room knowing everything was about to change? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. MS. Johnson, Richard said slowly, "What exactly do you want from me?" "Justice," she said without hesitation. "For every family your company has destroyed. For every community you've exploited. For every person who trusted you and got abandoned instead." The last word hit like a sledgehammer. Abandoned. She couldn't know who he was, but somehow every accusation felt deeply, personally aimed. Layla gathered her documents with efficient movements, preparing to leave. Richard felt panic rise in his chest. She was walking away, and he might never see her again. "Wait," he said, standing as she closed her briefcase. She paused, hand on the leather handle, and looked up at him. For just a moment, her professional mask slipped, and he saw something vulnerable underneath. Something that looked like hope mixed with fear. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice rougher than intended, "I think we should continue this conversation over dinner." The request surprised them both. It wasn't protocol for hostile business negotiations. It wasn't smart corporate strategy. It was a father desperate for more time with the daughter he'd lost. Layla's eyebrows rose. "Dinner. Tomorrow night. Neutral territory. We both know this conversation is more complicated than acquisition terms." She studied his face for a long moment, and Richard felt like she was seeing straight through him. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded. "Tomorrow night. 8 o'clock. Daniel's on 5th Avenue. She moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Mr. Collins? Don't mistake this for weakness. I meant every word I said today. Collins Industries will change, one way or another." As she gathered her files to leave, Richard's hand covered hers on the conference table, a touch that sent lightning through both of them. The contact was electric, unexpected, dangerous. "Ms. Johnson," he said quietly, "I think we should continue this conversation over dinner." The most expensive restaurant in Manhattan became the stage for a seduction neither of them planned, driven by a connection they couldn't name. Daniel's restaurant glowed with old money elegance, crystal chandeliers, mahogany panels, servers who moved like ghosts between tables where deals worth billions were discussed over wine that cost more than cars. Richard arrived first, securing a corner table where they could talk privately. He'd chosen a dark suit, subtle cologne, the kind of careful preparation he usually reserved for board meetings. But this wasn't business, even though both of them were pretending it was. Layla entered like she owned the place. Her dress was midnight blue silk, professional enough for business, elegant enough to stop conversations at nearby tables. She moved with confidence that drew every eye in the room, but Richard only saw how she paused at the hostess station, scanning the dining room with calculating eyes. She was nervous. The realization hit him with unexpected tenderness. "Ms. Johnson." He stood as the hostess led her over, pulling out her chair with old-fashioned courtesy that made her eyebrows rise. "Mr. Collins, thank you for dinner. Thank you for accepting." They settled into careful politeness, ordering wine and appetizers while dancing around the real reason they were there. The conversation should have been about acquisition terms and regulatory strategies. Instead, Richard found himself asking about her background. "Johns Hopkins is a prestigious school," he said, swirling his wine. "What drew you to business instead of medicine?" "Control," she answered without hesitation. "Medicine treats symptoms. Business addresses root causes. And you wanted to address root causes. I wanted to make sure what happened to my mother never happened to anyone else." The words hung between them, like a bridge neither dared to cross. Richard's chest tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Your mother was ill?" Layla's fingers traced the rim of her wine glass. "Lupus. She fought it for 8 years while working 2 jobs to pay for treatment that should have been covered by basic insurance." Richard's throat closed. He remembered Monica's diagnosis, the conversations about experimental treatments they couldn't afford, the insurance battles that consumed their savings. He'd walked away from all of it. That must have been difficult, he managed. It was a lesson in how the world really works. Her eyes met his across the candlelit table. Some people get to fight diseases. Others get to fight both diseases and the systems that profit from suffering. When was the last time someone made you forget your own rules? That's what happened to Richard as Layla talked about her mother's strength, her own determination to build something better, her vision for Justice Tech. She was brilliant, not just smart, brilliant in a way that made him want to hand her his company and ask what she'd do with it. Her mind worked like his, but with a moral compass he'd lost somewhere along the way. "What about you?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. "What drew you to business?" "Escape," he said honestly. "I grew up poor in rural Georgia. Business was the fastest way out. And you made it out. I made it out. He paused, studying her face in the candlelight. But sometimes I wonder what I left behind. Something shifted in her expression. For just a moment, her professional guard dropped, and he saw curiosity mixed with something that looked almost like recognition. "Do you have family, Mr. Collins?" The question hit like a knife between his ribs. "I was married once. It didn't work out. Children." Richard's hand tightened on his wine glass. No children. The lie burned his throat, but the truth would destroy them both. "That's too bad," Layla said softly. "You seem like you'd be a good father." The irony was devastating. Here was his daughter telling him he'd make a good father, while he'd failed so completely at being one that she didn't even know he existed. Dinner passed in a blur of intelligent conversation and electric tension. Layla was magnetic, passionate about her work, fierce in her convictions, surprisingly funny when she relaxed enough to let humor show. Richard found himself forgetting this was supposed to be a business meeting. He just wanted to keep her talking, keep her here, learn everything about the woman his daughter had become. "Tell me about growing up in Baltimore," he said over dessert. "It was good. Different from what you might expect." Her smile softened, becoming real instead of professional. "My mother made sure I understood that circumstances don't define possibilities." "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was everything." Layla's voice caught slightly. "Strong, kind, brilliant. She could have been anything, but she chose to be my mother instead." The pain in her voice was tangible. Richard wanted to reach across the table, wanted to tell her he understood, wanted to confess everything and beg forgiveness for the choices that had cost them all so much. Instead, he signaled for the check. "Let me drive you home," he said as they left the restaurant. "That's not necessary. It's late. Manhattan isn't always safe." She studied his face, looking for motives behind the offer. Whatever she saw there made her nod. His car was waiting, a black sedan with a driver who understood discretion. The ride to her apartment building should have taken 20 minutes. Richard told the driver to take the long way. Brooklyn looked different at night, softer around the edges. Layla pointed out landmarks as they drove. The community center where she'd volunteered in high school, the hospital where her mother had received treatment, the apartment building where she'd grown up. "Pull over here," she said suddenly as they passed a small park. Richard instructed the driver to stop. Layla got out without explanation, and he followed her to a bench overlooking the water. Manhattan sparkled across the river like scattered diamonds. "She used to bring me here when I was upset," Layla said, settling onto the bench. Said the water helped her think clearly. Richard sat beside her, close enough to catch her scent, vanilla and steel, vulnerability and strength. "What would she think of Justice Tech?" he asked. "She'd be proud and terrified." Layla smiled sadly. "She always worried I'd inherited too much of my father's ambition." Richard's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "According to my mother, my father was brilliant but reckless, driven to succeed, but not always careful about who got hurt along the way." The description was devastating in its accuracy. Richard stared out at the water, seeing his own reflection in the dark surface. "She talked about him often?" "Sometimes, usually when she thought I was making the same mistakes." Layla turned to look at Richard directly. She said he was the kind of man who could love someone completely, but still walk away if he thought it was best for his career. The words hit like physical blows. Richard's hands clenched in his lap as he fought the urge to confess everything. Drop a comment if you've ever been tempted to cross your own boundaries. What desire overrides logic? What do you choose? "He sounded complicated," Richard managed. He was, but she loved him anyway. That's what made his leaving so devastating. They sat in silence, watching the city lights reflect on the water. Richard felt the weight of 18 years pressing down on him. 18 years of wondering, regretting, missing the chance to know his daughter. "I should go," Layla said finally, but she didn't move. "Not yet," Richard said, his voice rougher than intended. She turned to look at him, and something shifted in the air between them. The professional distance collapsed, replaced by something electric and dangerous. "Mr. Collins." "Richard," he said. "Please." "Richard." His name on her lips sent heat through his chest. "This isn't smart." "I know," but neither of them moved away. The space between them seemed to shrink, magnetic and inevitable. "I should get home," she whispered, but her eyes said something different. "You should," he agreed, leaning closer. The kiss almost happened. Their faces were inches apart, breath mingling in the cool night air. Richard could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Then her phone rang. The sound shattered the moment. Layla jerked back, fumbling for her phone with shaking hands. "I have to take this," she said, voice unsteady. Richard watched her face change as she listened to whoever was calling. Business by the look of it. Something important enough to break whatever spell had been building between them. "I have to go," she said, ending the call. "Early meeting tomorrow." He walked her to her building in trance, neither of them mentioning what had almost happened. At her door, she turned to face him. "Thank you for dinner, and for listening about my mother. Thank you for sharing her with me." She smiled, soft and real and heartbreaking. "Good night, Richard." As Richard's lips brushed her ear, whispering goodnight, Layla felt something she'd never experienced. The dangerous thrill of wanting to surrender control. She had no idea she was falling for the one man who could destroy everything she'd built. She gave herself to him completely that night, never knowing she was sleeping with the ghost who had haunted her mother's dreams. The rain started during Layla's morning meeting with her legal team. By afternoon, it was a full storm, turning Manhattan streets into rivers and forcing everyone to seek shelter wherever they could find it. Layla should have gone home, should have called a car service and retreated to her Brooklyn apartment to review acquisition contracts and prepare for the week ahead. Instead, she found herself standing in the lobby of Richard's building, soaked to the skin and shivering. She told herself it was about the contract terms they hadn't finished discussing at dinner, about the business deal that could change both their companies forever, about anything except the way he'd looked at her in the park, the way her skin had burned where his breath touched her ear. The doorman recognized her from the night before and called up to Richard's penthouse without question. The elevator ride to the 58th floor felt endless, her reflection in the polished doors showing mascara smudged and hair plastered to her head. What was she doing here? The elevator opened directly into his apartment, and Richard was waiting. He'd changed from his business suit into dark jeans and a white button-down, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He looked younger, more relaxed, devastatingly handsome. "Layla." Her name on his lips sent heat straight through her chest. "What are you doing here?" "I was in the neighborhood." The lie was transparent, but he didn't call her on it. "In this storm, I wanted to finish our conversation about the acquisition terms." Another lie. They both knew it. Richard stepped aside to let her in, and Layla's breath caught. His penthouse was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows showing the storm raging over Manhattan. Modern furniture in warm neutrals, art that probably cost more than most people's houses. But what caught her attention was the bar cart in the corner, where 2 glasses of wine sat waiting. "Expecting someone?" she asked. "Hoping," he said simply. The honesty in his voice made her chest tight. He'd been waiting for her. Somehow, he'd known she'd come. "Let me get you a towel," he said, disappearing into what she assumed was his bedroom. Layla used the moment alone to study his space. Everything was expensive, but not ostentatious. Comfortable. The kind of place someone actually lived, not just displayed wealth. Photos lined the mantelpiece above a gas fireplace. Richard at various business events, accepting awards, shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. But no family photos. No pictures of parents or siblings or significant others. Just like her own apartment. Just like her own life. Here. Richard returned with a thick towel and a Columbia University sweatshirt. "The bathroom's through there if you want to change." His sweatshirt was soft and enormous on her, falling almost to her knees. It smelled like him, clean and masculine with hints of the cologne he wore. When she emerged from the bathroom, her wet clothes in hand, Richard was building a fire. "Better?" he asked, turning to look at her. "Much." She settled onto the leather couch, tucking her legs under her. "Thank you." Richard poured wine and joined her on the couch, careful to maintain respectful distance. Outside, lightning illuminated the storm clouds, followed by thunder that shook the windows. "Hell of a storm," he said, perfect night to stay in. They talked easily, the conversation flowing like the wine. Business at first, then books, travel, childhood memories carefully edited to avoid dangerous territory. Richard was intelligent and funny, passionate about things she hadn't expected. Art, music, social justice issues that surprised her. "You're not what I expected," Layla said, curled against the couch cushions with her second glass of wine warming her from the inside. "What did you expect? Typical billionaire CEO. Cold, calculating, interested only in profit margins." Disappointed? She studied his face in the firelight. Strong jaw, intelligent eyes, smile lines that suggested he laughed more than his reputation indicated. "Confused," she said honestly. "About what?" "About why someone like you would build the kind of company I'm trying to tear down." Richard's expression darkened. "People aren't always who they seem to be, Layla. Sometimes circumstances force choices that don't reflect who you really are." "What circumstances forced you?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded like regret. "Fear. Pride. The kind of ambition that makes you think success can fix whatever's broken inside you." "And did it? Fix what was broken?" "No." He met her eyes directly. "It just broke different things." The vulnerability in his voice made her chest tight. This wasn't the ruthless CEO she'd researched. This was a man carrying weight she could see but not understand. "Have you ever wanted someone you knew you shouldn't? When desire overrides logic, what do you choose?" "Richard," she said softly. "Layla, you should go home." "Should I?" "Yes, because if you stay much longer, I'm going to do something we'll both regret." The warning should have sent her running. Instead, it sent heat pooling low in her belly. "What if I don't want to go home?" His eyes darkened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm a grown woman who makes her own choices." She set down her wine glass and moved closer to him on the couch. "And I choose to stay." "Layla." She silenced him by pressing her lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, a question more than a demand. But when he responded, when his hands came up to frame her face, it deepened into something desperate and hungry. Richard tasted like wine and possibility. His hands were gentle but sure as they moved through her hair, down her back, pulling her closer until she was straddling his lap. "Are you sure?" he whispered against her lips. "I'm sure." But even as she said it, something flickered in the back of her mind. A feeling of familiarity she couldn't place, a sense that this moment was both completely new and somehow inevitable. Richard carried her to his bedroom, where city lights painted patterns across the hardwood floors. Rain streaked the windows as he laid her gently on his bed, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the hem of his sweatshirt she wore. "You're beautiful," he whispered, and the reverence in his voice made her feel like something precious. He undressed her slowly, carefully, like she was something that might break. His touch was worship and question combined. Gentle fingers tracing the curve of her shoulder, soft lips following the path his hands had mapped. "Is this okay?" he asked against her collarbone. "Yes," she breathed, surprised by how much she meant it. He made love to her like he was memorizing every moment, every sigh, every place his hands could bring her pleasure. There was something almost desperate in the way he touched her, like he was afraid she might disappear. "You're perfect," he murmured against her throat, and she believed him. Their bodies moved together with surprising harmony, like they'd been meant for this moment. Richard was patient and thorough, bringing her to the edge twice before finally letting her fall apart in his arms. Afterward, they lay tangled in his sheets, her head on his chest while he traced patterns on her bare shoulder. The storm had passed, leaving the city quiet and washed clean outside his windows. "Stay," he whispered in her hair. "I should go home. Stay, please." There was something vulnerable in his voice that made her chest tight. She lifted her head to look at him, seeing something raw and unguarded in his expression. "Just tonight," she said. He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Just tonight." But as she drifted towards sleep in his arms, Layla felt the dangerous pull of wanting more than just tonight. Richard Collins was supposed to be her target, her professional adversary. Instead, he was becoming something much more complicated, something that felt like home. Richard lay awake long after her breathing evened out, staring at the ceiling while his daughter slept in his arms. The guilt was crushing, not just for what he'd done, but for how right it had felt, how complete he'd felt holding her. This was wrong on every level he could imagine. But as dawn broke over Manhattan, casting golden light across Layla's peaceful face, Richard made a choice that would damn them both. He wasn't going to let her go. Tell me about your most forbidden attraction. When someone makes you forget your own rules, what do you choose? Share your story in the comments below. As dawn broke over Manhattan, Richard traced his fingers along her sleeping form and whispered the truth he couldn't say aloud. "I'm sorry, baby girl. I'm so sorry." If she'd been awake to hear it, everything would have changed. But Layla was already stirring, the morning light pulling her from dreams filled with warmth and safety she'd never experienced before. When she opened her eyes and saw Richard watching her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache, she knew she was in trouble. Not just because sleeping with him complicated her business plans, but because somewhere in the night, she'd started falling in love with the one man who could destroy everything she'd built to honor her mother's memory. And she had no idea the man whose arms felt like home was the same man who had broken her mother's heart 18 years ago. Mixing business with pleasure is dangerous, but when your lover is also your target, it becomes deadly. 3 weeks passed in a blur of stolen moments and secret meetings. Conference rooms became battlegrounds during the day. Then bedrooms became sanctuaries at night. Layla would argue acquisition terms with Richard across mahogany tables, then surrender to his touch between silk sheets. It was the most dangerous game she'd ever played. "The Justice Tech proposal stands," Layla said during their Tuesday morning meeting, her voice professionally cold despite the fact that Richard's hands had been all over her body just hours before. "Collins Industries can sell us the ethical technology division, or we'll destroy your market share through direct competition." Richard leaned back in his conference chair, studying her with dark eyes that knew exactly how she looked when she came apart in his arms. "Ms. Johnson, your terms are still unacceptable." The formal distance between them was theater. Everyone in the room, lawyers, executives, board members, believed they were watching a standard corporate negotiation. They had no idea the real battle was happening in glances and carefully controlled expressions. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Richard suggested. 20 minutes later, they were alone in his office, the door locked, her back pressed against the wall while he kissed her like he was drowning. "This is insane," she gasped between kisses. "Completely," he agreed, his lips moving down her throat. "But I can't stop." Neither could she. That was the problem. Richard's office had become their secret world. After hours, when the building emptied and security guards made their rounds, she would slip up to the 52nd floor using the private elevator key he'd given her. They would make love on a leather couch overlooking Central Park, her cries muffled against his shoulder while the city sparkled below them. Sometimes they managed actual conversation afterward, lying naked and talking about books, dreams, the kind of future neither dared to name. "My team thinks I'm losing my edge," Layla admitted one night, her head on his chest while he traced lazy patterns on her bare back. "What?" "Because I should have destroyed Collins Industries by now. 3 weeks ago, I had you backed into a corner. Now we're still negotiating." Richard's hand stilled on her skin. "Maybe you don't want to destroy us. Maybe I don't want to destroy you." The distinction was important. Layla was falling for Richard Collins the man, even as she prepared to tear down Richard Collins the CEO. The two sides of him existed in separate compartments in her mind, lover and target, the man who made her feel safe and the empire that represented everything she fought against. Can you really separate business from personal feelings? Have you ever had to choose between love and ambition? The question haunted every decision she made. Her assistant Elena was getting suspicious. "Boss, what's really going on with the Collins deal? 6 months ago, you would have buried them by now." "The legal complications are more complex than we anticipated," Layla lied smoothly. "Since when do legal complications slow you down?" "Since she started sleeping with the opposing counsel. Since she started falling in love with her enemy." since everything got twisted into knots she couldn't untangle. Richard's team was asking similar questions. His CFO cornered him after a board meeting where they'd approved another round of negotiations instead of launching their planned counterattack against Justice Tech. "Sir, with respect, Johnson is playing games with us. Her demands keep changing, her timeline keeps shifting. It's like she's deliberately prolonging these talks. Maybe she's trying to find common ground," Richard suggested. "Or maybe she's gathering intelligence for a bigger attack. We should cut off negotiations and go on the offensive." Richard's jaw tightened. Go on the offensive against his daughter. Attack the woman he was falling deeper in love with every day. "We'll give negotiations another month," he decided. His CFO's eyebrows rose. "A month? Sir, that seems—" "A month," Richard repeated, his tone ending the discussion. But he knew they were running out of time. Sooner or later, one of their teams would force a decision. The business world was getting impatient with their prolonged dance. Meanwhile, the personal relationship was getting more intense. Richard found himself thinking about Layla constantly. Her laugh, her brilliant mind, the way she looked when she was concentrating on a problem. He was falling in love with his daughter, and the knowledge was eating him alive. The worst part was how naturally it felt. When they were together, everything made sense. She challenged him intellectually, matched his ambition, understood the drive that had shaped his life. She was everything he'd hoped his child would become, and everything he'd never dared to dream he could have in a partner. "Tell me about your mother," he said one evening as they shared takeout in his apartment. Layla's expression softened. "She was incredible. Strongest person I ever knew." "What was she like when you were growing up?" "Fierce. Protective. She worked herself half to death making sure I had opportunities she never got." Richard's chest tightened. "She sounded amazing. She was. Even when she was sick, even when the medical bills were crushing us, she never let me see her as anything less than invincible." "You miss her?" "Every day." Layla's voice caught. "She died believing my father was a good man who'd been taken too soon. I couldn't bear to tell her the truth about what kind of person would abandon his sick wife." The words hit Richard like physical blows. Monica had protected his memory, even after he'd destroyed their marriage. She'd let their daughter believe he was dead, rather than admit he'd chosen his career over his family. "Maybe he had reasons you don't understand," Richard said quietly. "What reason could possibly justify abandoning someone you love when they need you most?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Richard stared into his wine glass, seeing his own reflection distorted in the dark liquid. "Fear," he said finally. "Weakness. The kind of cowardice that disguises itself as practical thinking." Layla studied his face. "You sound like you speak from experience. We all have moments we're not proud of." She moved closer to him on the couch, her hand finding his. "Tell me about yours." Richard almost did. The confession was right there, burning in his throat. He wanted to tell her everything. Who he was, what he'd done, how sorry he was for choices that had cost them both so much. But the words wouldn't come, because telling her the truth meant losing her forever. Share your story. When someone makes you feel at home, but represents everything you're fighting against, what do you choose? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Instead, he kissed her, deep and desperate, pouring 18 years of regret into the connection between their lips. She kissed him back with equal intensity, and for a moment, nothing else existed except the two of them. Later, as she slept in his arms, Richard's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his head of security. 3 words that made his blood turn to ice. "She's been investigating." The attached photos showed Layla meeting with private investigators, studying documents, asking questions about Richard's past. She wasn't just sleeping with him, she was hunting him, and she was getting close to the truth. When Layla's assistant handed her the leaked documents about Richard's past marriage to a woman named Monica Johnson, her blood turned to ice. The name was too familiar, the timeline too perfect. This couldn't be coincidence. The photograph hidden in her mother's jewelry box would either destroy them both or finally reveal the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Layla's hands shook as she spread the leaked documents across her kitchen table. Marriage certificate, Richard James Collins and Monica Rose Johnson. Date, June 15th, 2003. Location: Atlanta, Georgia. Her mother's name. Her mother's hometown. The year before Layla was born. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of mistake, some cosmic joke that made her stomach turn and her vision blur. But the documents looked authentic. Official stamps, notarized signatures, filing numbers that could be verified. Elena had gotten them from a contact at the courthouse, someone who specialized in finding buried records for the right price. "I thought you should see these before we use them," Elena had said, setting the envelope on Layla's desk like it contained explosives. "The timeline matches your mother's story about your father. A guy named Richard Collins was married to a Monica Johnson in Atlanta right before you were born." Layla had managed to keep her expression neutral until Elena left. Then she locked her office door and stared at the papers until the words blurred together. Richard Collins, the man she was sleeping with, the man she was falling in love with, might be your father. Now she sat in her mother's old bedroom, surrounded by boxes she'd never had the courage to fully unpack after the funeral. Her mother's jewelry box sat open on the nightstand, playing its tiny melody while Layla searched through photos and letters she'd avoided for 2 years. There had to be something. Some proof that this was all a terrible mistake. Her mother's photo albums told the story of a life carefully documented but strategically edited. Pictures of Layla as a baby, as a toddler, growing up in Baltimore. But nothing from before they moved there. No wedding photos, no pictures of her parents together, no evidence of the life they'd supposedly shared in Atlanta. It was like Monica's history had started when Layla was born. The jewelry box yielded treasures she'd forgotten: her grandmother's wedding ring, the pearl earrings Monica had worn to Layla's high school graduation, a locket that had belonged to her great aunt. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that crackled with age, a photograph. Layla's heart stopped. The picture showed her mother laughing up at a man whose face was turned away from the camera. Monica looked young, radiant, completely happy. She wore a simple white dress and held a bouquet of daisies. A wedding photo. Layla turned the picture over with trembling fingers. In her mother's handwriting, "Richard and me, June 2003. The happiest day of my life." The photograph fluttered from Layla's fingers as she stared at the man in the image. She couldn't see his face clearly, but his build, his posture, the way he held himself, it was familiar. Too familiar. Her phone rang. Richard's name on the screen. "Hello," she answered, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Good evening, beautiful. Are you free for dinner?" Beautiful. He called her beautiful the same way he whispered it when they were making love. The same way a man might talk to a woman he was falling for. Not the way a father should ever talk to his daughter. "I can't tonight," she said. "I'm not feeling well." "What's wrong? Should I come over?" "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "I just need some rest." There was a pause. "Layla, are you sure you're all right? You sound upset." She was upset. She was horrified, terrified, confused in ways that made her want to scream. "I'm Phoenix. I'll call you tomorrow." She hung up before he could respond, then immediately turned off her phone. The photograph lay on the floor where it had fallen. Monica's joyful face smiled up at her, frozen in a moment of pure happiness with a man who might be, who probably was, who had to be, Richard Collins, her father, the man she'd been sleeping with for 3 weeks. Layla ran to the bathroom and threw up until there was nothing left but dry heaves and the taste of bile. Then she sat on the cold tile floor and tried to make sense of what she'd discovered. The timeline fit perfectly. Her parents had married in June 2003. Layla was born in February 2004. Her mother had moved to Baltimore when Layla was an infant, claiming her husband had died in a car accident. But Richard Collins was very much alive, building an empire in New York while his wife struggled to raise their daughter alone. When was the last time you discovered a truth that changed everything you believed about yourself? Share your thoughts below if you've ever had your world turned upside down by a family secret. Layla's phone buzzed with text messages she couldn't bring herself to read. Richard, probably wondering why she'd hung up on him. Maybe planning to surprise her with flowers or dinner or one of the thoughtful gestures that had been making her fall deeper in love with him. The man who was supposed to be dead. The man who might be your father. The the man whose child she could be carrying. That last thought sent her running to the bathroom again. When the nausea passed, she forced herself to think logically. She needed proof. Real, undeniable evidence that would either confirm her worst fears or put them to rest forever. A DNA test was the obvious answer, but getting Richard's DNA without his knowledge would be tricky. She'd have to be careful, strategic. One mistake, and he'd know she suspected something. Meanwhile, she had to keep seeing him, had to pretend nothing had changed while her world crumbled around her, had to let him touch her, kiss her, make love to her, while fighting the revulsion that threatened to overwhelm her every time she looked at his face. Because until she knew for certain, she couldn't risk tipping him off. If Richard really was her father, if he'd recognized her and stayed silent while pursuing a relationship anyway, then he was more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. And if he was innocent, if this was all some horrible coincidence, then she owed it to both of them to find out before destroying everything they'd built together. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror looked pale and haunted. Dark circles under her eyes, lips still swollen from Richard's kisses, skin that smelled like his cologne. She looked like a woman in love. She felt like a woman losing her mind. Have you ever found evidence that your world was built on a lie? How far would you go to uncover the truth, even if it might destroy you? Comment below with your story. The DNA testing kit would arrive tomorrow. Express delivery to her office, where Elena wouldn't ask questions about packages marked confidential medical supplies. Until then, she had to survive, had to pretend, had to look the man she loved in the eye and act like she didn't suspect he might be the father who'd abandoned her before she was old enough to remember his face. The photograph lay on her bedroom floor like evidence of a crime. Monica's happy smile seemed to mock her daughter's horror, as if asking, "What will you do now that you know the truth your mother died protecting?" Layla picked up the picture with steady hands and slipped it into her purse. Tomorrow, she would get the answers that would either destroy her family or destroy her heart. Maybe both. The DNA testing kit arrived the next morning. As Layla held the swab that would either destroy her family or destroy her relationship, she realized some truths were too dangerous to know and too important to ignore. Some secrets explode like bombs. Others seep in slowly like poison, killing everything they touch. The DNA testing kit sat in Layla's office desk drawer for 3 days while she tried to work up the courage to use it. The small blue box felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds every time she opened the drawer to retrieve files or pens. Meanwhile, Richard kept calling, kept texting, kept showing up at her office with coffee and concerned questions about why she seemed distant. "You've been avoiding me," he said Thursday evening, appearing in her doorway after Elena had gone home. "Did I do something wrong?" Layla looked up from the contracts she'd been pretending to review, taking in his worried expression, the way he held himself like he was preparing for bad news. "I've been busy," she said. Not technically a lie. "Too busy for dinner? Too busy to return my calls." He moved into her office, closing the door behind him. The click of the lock made her skin crawl, though she couldn't say why. "I've had a lot on my mind," she said. "Want to talk about it?" Everything inside her screamed yes. She wanted to throw the photograph on her desk and demand explanations. Wanted to ask him point blank if he'd ever been married to a woman named Monica Johnson. Wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until the truth fell out. Instead, she forced a smile. Just work stress. The Collins Industries acquisition is more complicated than I expected. Richard's expression shifted, becoming unreadable. In what way? Legal complications. Background research is turning up inconsistencies. It wasn't entirely a lie. The biggest inconsistency was sitting across from her desk, looking concerned about her well-being while possibly being her biological father. What kind of inconsistencies? Layla met his eyes directly. Personal history discrepancies. Things that don't match public records. Richard went very still. Such as marriage records, mostly. There seems to be some confusion about your previous relationships. The silence stretched between them like a tightrope. Richard's face gave nothing away, but Layla caught something flickering in his eyes. Recognition? Fear? Guilt? My personal life has always been private, he said finally. Private and hidden aren't the same thing. What exactly are you asking me, Layla? She wanted to ask him everything. Instead, she shrugged and looked back down at her contracts. I'm not asking anything, just doing my due diligence. Richard stood there for another long moment, then moved around her desk to stand behind her chair. His hands settled on her shoulders, and she had to fight not to flinch. You're tense, he said, his thumbs working at the knots in her neck. His touch used to relax her. Now it made her skin crawl with possibilities she couldn't face. Long day, she managed. Come home with me. Let me help you relax. Home. He was calling his penthouse home, like she belonged there, like they had a future together. I can't tonight. Early morning tomorrow. His hands stilled on her shoulders. Layla, what's really going on? You've been different since Tuesday. Distant. If I did something, you didn't do anything, she said quickly. Too quickly. Richard spun her chair around, so she faced him, his dark eyes searching her face. Then what? For a moment, she almost told him. The truth sat right there on her tongue, begging to be spoken. But looking at his face, concerned, caring, possibly loving, she couldn't do it. Not until she knew for sure. I'm just tired, she said. This deal is taking a lot out of me. He studied her for another moment, then leaned down and kissed her forehead. Get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow. After he left, Layla sat alone in her office and finally opened the desk drawer. The DNA kit seemed to mock her hesitation. What's worse, a secret that ruins your past or one that destroys your future? When family secrets explode, how do you pick up the pieces? Friday morning, she called in sick and drove to Richard's office building. Not to see him, he was in meetings all morning, but to retrieve what she needed. The executive bathroom on the 52nd floor was empty at 10 a.m. Richard's coffee cup sat on the counter by the sink, lipstick still warm against porcelain where his mouth had been. Layla's hands shook as she swabbed the rim of the cup, sealing the sample in the sterile container the testing company had provided. The whole process took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like crossing a line she could never uncross. Her own DNA sample had been easier. A quick swab of her cheek in her apartment bathroom, tears streaming down her face as she sealed her genetic code into a plastic tube. The testing facility promised results in 72 hours with rush processing. 72 hours to find out if the man she was falling in love with was actually her father. 72 hours to wait for her world to either collapse or continue spinning on its axis. Saturday and Sunday crawled by like wounded animals. Richard called, but she let the calls go to voicemail. He texted, but she replied with brief excuses about feeling sick. By Sunday evening, he was worried enough to show up at her apartment with soup and medicine. You look terrible, he said when she answered the door. She probably did. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since sending off the DNA samples. Food tasted like cardboard. Everything reminded her of questions she couldn't answer. Thanks, she said dryly. Can I come in? She wanted to say no, wanted to close the door and hide until the test results came back. But refusing would raise more questions she wasn't ready to answer. Richard made himself at home in her kitchen, heating soup and making tea like they were a normal couple dealing with normal problems. He moved through her space with familiar ease, and watching him made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. You're taking care of me, she said when he brought her a bowl of soup in bed. That's what people do when they care about each other. Care about each other. Such careful words. Not love. Not yet, but something moving in that direction. Richard, she said, setting down the soup spoon. Can I ask you something? His expression grew cautious. Of course. Do you think some secrets are too big to forgive? The question seemed to hit him like a physical blow. Color drained from his face, and his hands clenched in his lap. That depends, he said slowly. On what? On whether the secret was meant to protect or to deceive. Layla studied his face, looking for clues in the careful way he chose his words. What if it was both? Richard was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded like pain. Then I suppose it depends on whether forgiveness is possible after the truth comes out. Is it possible? I hope so. He met her eyes directly. Because some secrets are kept out of love, even when keeping them causes more damage than telling the truth ever could. The intensity in his voice made her chest tight. He was trying to tell her something without actually saying it, dancing around words that might change everything between them, just like she was doing. Monday morning arrived gray and rainy, matching Layla's mood as she waited for her phone to ring. The testing facility had promised results by noon. At 11:47 a.m., her phone buzzed with an email marked confidential results. Layla stared at the subject line for a full minute before opening it. The words on the screen hit her like a physical blow. Probability of biological relationship, 99.97%. The phone slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor. Around her, the world continued spinning. Traffic sounds from the street, her assistant answering phones in the outer office, the normal rhythm of a normal day. But nothing would ever be normal again. Richard Collins was her father, the man she'd been sleeping with, the man she was falling in love with, the man whose touch made her feel safe and wanted and complete. He was her biological father. And somehow, impossibly, he had to know. How do you rebuild your identity when everything you believed was wrong? Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything? Tell me how you survived in the comments below. When Richard showed up at her apartment that evening with champagne and plans for the future, Layla stood in the doorway, knowing she had to choose. Destroy him with the truth or destroy herself by staying silent. The words, "You're my father," hung in the air between them like a death sentence for both their hearts. Richard arrived at Layla's apartment with a bottle of Dom Perignon and a smile that made her stomach turn. He looked happy, relaxed, like a man who decided to stop fighting his feelings and embrace whatever was building between them. He had no idea she'd spent the day planning his destruction. "You look better," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. Feeling recovered? Much better. The lie came easily now. She'd had 3 days to practice deception. He followed her into the apartment, setting the champagne on her kitchen counter with the care of someone performing a ritual. "What's the occasion?" she asked. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, about secrets and forgiveness." Layla's blood turned to ice. "Oh, I've decided you're right. Some secrets are too important to keep, even when telling the truth might destroy everything." He moved closer to her, reaching for her hands. His touch, which had once made her feel cherished, now made her skin crawl. "Richard, let me say this first," he interrupted. "Whatever happens after tonight, I want you to know that these past few weeks have been the best of my life. You've made me remember who I used to be before ambition and fear turned me into someone I didn't recognize." The sincerity in his voice was devastating. He meant every word, which made what she had to do even more cruel. "I need to tell you something too," she said, pulling her hands free from his. "Can it wait? Because what I have to say is going to change everything between us." "So is what I have to say." They stared at each other across her small kitchen, both carrying secrets that would destroy whatever fragile thing they'd built together. "You first," Layla said. She wanted to hear him confess, wanted to know if he'd figured out who she was, if he'd been lying to her this whole time. Richard took a deep breath, running his hands through his hair. 18 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. I was married to a woman I loved desperately, but when she got sick, really sick, I panicked. I was young, ambitious, terrified of watching her die slowly. Layla's heart hammered against her ribs. He was going to tell her. Finally, after weeks of lies and deception, he was going to admit the truth. "So I left," Richard continued, his voice breaking. "I filed for divorce while she was in the hospital and walked away from the only real love I'd ever known. I told myself it was because I couldn't handle her illness, but the truth was worse. I was afraid her medical bills would destroy everything I'd worked for." Tears ran down his face as he spoke. Real tears, carrying 18 years of guilt and regret. "Her name was Monica," he said. "Monica Johnson. She was pregnant when I left." The words hit Layla like physical blows. Pregnant. He knew about the pregnancy. Knew he'd abandoned his sick wife and unborn child. "I never met my daughter," Richard continued. "Monica moved away and told everyone I died. For all practical purposes, I had died. The man who could abandon his family like that, he wasn't worth knowing. Why are you telling me this? Layla's voice sounded strange, distant. Because I'm in love with you. The confession should have been beautiful. Instead, it was the most horrific thing she'd ever heard. And because you deserve to know who you're falling for. I'm not a good man, Layla. I'm someone who chose money over love, career over family. I'm someone who destroyed the most precious thing in my life because I was too weak to fight for it. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Richard wiped his eyes, looking vulnerable and broken and completely unaware that he'd just confessed to abandoning the woman standing in front of him. Say something, he whispered. Please. Layla walked to her purse and pulled out the photograph she'd been carrying for a week. Monica's smiling face, Richard's profile, June 2003 written in her mother's hopeful handwriting. She set it on the kitchen counter between them. Richard's face went white as he stared at the image. His hands shook as he picked it up, studying the faces of his past with growing horror. Where did you get this? He asked. From my mother's jewelry box. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Richard's eyes moved from the photograph to Layla's face, and she watched the exact moment when recognition hit him. The resemblance was unmistakable once you knew to look for it. Monica's bone structure with Richard's dark eyes. Monica's determination with Richard's intelligence. No, he whispered. No, that's not possible. DNA test says otherwise. Layla pulled the lab results from her purse and threw them on the counter. 99.97% probability. Congratulations, Daddy. You found your daughter after all. Richard staggered backward like she'd shot him. His face went from white to gray, and for a moment she thought he might pass out. Layla, don't. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. Don't say my name. Don't touch me. Don't ever come near me again. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. The rage she'd been holding back for days finally erupted. You recognized me, didn't you? That first night at the convention center, you knew exactly who I was. Yes, but you knew I was your daughter, and you seduced me anyway. No. The denial tore from his throat. I didn't know. I suspected, but I didn't know for sure until... Until when? Richard's silence was answer enough. Until after you'd already been sleeping with me. Layla finished. Jesus Christ, he showed you. How long have you known? The private investigator confirmed it last week. He whispered, but I've suspected since the first time I saw you on that stage. What's worse, a secret that ruins your past or one that destroys your future? When family secrets explode, how do you pick up the pieces? Tell me in the comments if you've ever faced an impossible truth. The wine glass flew from Layla's hand before she realized she'd thrown it. It shattered against the wall behind Richard's head, sending red liquid running down white paint like blood. You sick bastard, she screamed. You knew I was your daughter, and you pursued me anyway. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Explain to me how you justify sleeping with your own child. Richard flinched like she'd slapped him. I fell in love with you before I knew. By the time I suspected the truth, I was already. Already what? Already inside me? Already making me fall for the man who destroyed my mother's life. Each word was designed to wound, and they hit their target perfectly. Richard crumpled against her kitchen counter, broken and guilty and destroyed. I never meant for this to happen, he said. But it did happen, and now we both have to live with it. Layla moved toward her front door, opening it wide. Cold evening air rushed in, carrying the sounds of normal people living normal lives. Get out, she said. Layla, please. Get out. Richard gathered the champagne bottle with shaking hands, moving toward the door like a man walking to his execution. I'm sorry, he said as he passed her. I'm so sorry for everything. For leaving your mother, for not being there when you needed me, for letting this happen between us. Sorry doesn't fix anything. I know. He paused in the doorway, looking back at her with eyes full of love and regret and desperate hope. But I need you to know that despite everything, despite how wrong this all went, loving you is the most real thing I've felt in 18 years. The confession should have meant something. Instead, it made her feel sick. That makes it worse, not better, she said. Richard nodded like he'd expected that response. Can you ever forgive me? Layla looked at the man who'd given her life, then abandoned her, then found her again in the worst possible way. The man whose touch had made her feel complete while tearing her world apart. I'm going to destroy you, she said quietly. I'm going to tear down everything you've built, just like you tore down my mother's life. That's the only closure either of us is going to get. As Richard fell to his knees begging forgiveness for sins he didn't even know he'd committed, Layla walked out with one final promise. I'm going to destroy everything you built, just like you destroyed my mother. Hell hath no fury like a daughter scorned, especially one with the business acumen to actually destroy her father's empire. The war room Layla created in her penthouse apartment would have impressed military generals. Whiteboards covered every wall, displaying Collins Industries' corporate structure, financial vulnerabilities, and key business relationships. Red strings connected photos and documents like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. But this wasn't paranoia. This was systematic destruction. Boss, are you sure about this? Elena asked, surveying the organized chaos Layla had built over the weekend. This goes way beyond hostile takeover. This is scorched earth. Good, Layla said, marking another target on her whiteboard. I want there to be nothing left. Elena studied her boss with growing concern. Something fundamental had changed in Layla since Thursday. The focused businesswoman had been replaced by someone colder, harder, driven by fury that seemed to burn without consuming itself. What did Collins do to you? Layla's marker froze against the whiteboard. How could she explain that Richard Collins had done the worst thing imaginable? Not just abandon her mother, but found his daughter again and somehow managed to fall in love with her. He destroyed my family a long time ago, she said finally. Now it's my turn. The first target was Collins Industries' biggest investor, Marcus Hendricks, whose venture capital firm had pumped $200 million into Richard's expansion plans. Layla knew Marcus's type: brilliant, ruthless, loyal only to profit margins. She also knew his weakness. Marcus had been trying to get Justice Tech into his portfolio since the company launched. A few carefully placed phone calls, and he was taking her to dinner at the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan. Ms. Johnson, Marcus said, raising his wine glass in a toast. To unexpected partnerships. Layla smiled, the same predatory expression she perfected in boardrooms across the country. To profitable ones. Marcus was exactly what she'd expected. Silver-haired, expensive suit, the kind of confidence that came from never losing a bet that mattered. He was also completely unaware that he was about to become a weapon in someone else's war. Your company's trajectory is remarkable, he said as they settled into dinner. 200 million valuation in 3 years. Most entrepreneurs would kill for those numbers. Most entrepreneurs don't understand the long game, Layla replied, cutting her steak with surgical precision. Justice Tech isn't just about current profits. It's about reshaping entire industries, including the industry that Richard Collins dominates. There it was, the opening she'd been waiting for. Collins Industries represents everything wrong with modern corporate culture, she said, letting real passion creep into her voice. Profit over people, growth over ethics, shareholders over communities. Marcus leaned forward. You sound like you have personal experience with their business practices. I've seen what companies like Collins do to families. The medical bankruptcies, the communities destroyed by predatory lending, the way they exploit regulatory loopholes while people suffer. She wasn't lying. She had seen all of that in her own life, watching her mother struggle against systems designed to profit from illness. And you think Justice Tech can change that? I know it can, but only with the right backing. Layla met his eyes directly, the kind of backing that isn't afraid to take on established empires. Marcus was hooked. She could see it in the way he leaned closer, the calculation flickering behind his eyes as he reimagined his portfolio without Collins Industries and with Justice Tech instead. What kind of numbers are we talking about? Layla had spent all weekend preparing for this question. Her proposal was generous enough to tempt him, structured enough to seem legitimate, and devastating enough to cripple Richard's cash flow when Marcus inevitably pulled his investment. $500 million over 3 years, she said. Exclusive partnership with Justice Tech's expansion into Collins's current markets. Marcus nearly choked on his wine. $500 million to completely dominate the ethical technology sector. Collins Industries can't compete if they're fighting both market pressure and cash flow problems simultaneously. She was offering him a chance to back the winning side in a war he didn't fully understand. Marcus wasn't stupid. He knew there was more to this than market competition, but he also knew opportunity when he saw it. "I need to review your business plan in detail," he said. "Of course. My team can have comprehensive projections to you by Friday." They shook hands over dessert, and Layla felt the first piece of Richard's empire crack away. Marcus Hendricks would pull his investment from Collins Industries within a month. Without that capital, Richard would have to choose between scaling back operations or finding new funding at much worse terms. Either option would make him vulnerable to further attacks. Can revenge ever really heal the wounds that created it? When someone destroys your family, is destroying them back justice or just more destruction? Share your thoughts below. The second target was Richard's head of technology, Dr. Sarah Chun. Brilliant, ambitious, and chronically underpaid for someone of her caliber. Layla had been tracking Sarah's patent applications for months, noting innovations that Collins Industries had developed but never properly monetized. "Dr. Chun," Layla said when Sarah answered her phone Tuesday morning. "This is Layla Johnson from Justice Tech. I'd like to discuss a career opportunity." The meeting took place in a neutral coffee shop downtown. Sarah arrived looking curious and slightly nervous, the expression of someone who knew they were valuable but had never been properly valued. "I've been following your work on sustainable server architecture," Layla began. "Your carbon-neutral data center design could revolutionize the industry." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "You're familiar with my research?" "I'm familiar with everything you've developed at Collins Industries, including the projects they've shelved because they don't fit their profit model." That at home, Layla watched Sarah's expression shift from curiosity to frustration. "Richard doesn't understand the long-term implications of sustainable technology," Sarah said carefully. "He's focused on quarterly returns instead of industry transformation. What if I told you Justice Tech was prepared to fund sustainable research without profit limitations? Full development budgets, patent ownership sharing, and compensation that reflects your actual value to the industry." The offer was more than generous, it was revolutionary. Sarah would go from being an underpaid employee to being a partner in reshaping how technology companies approached environmental responsibility. "What would you need from me?" "Your expertise, your research, and your current project files." Sarah went very still. "You're asking me to steal from Collins Industries. I'm asking you to take ownership of work you created. There's a difference." It was a legal gray area at best, corporate espionage at worst. But Sarah had been watching her innovations gather dust, while Collins Industries focused on less innovative but more profitable ventures. "I need guarantees," she said finally. "Legal protection, intellectual property rights, full research autonomy." Done. They shook hands over coffee that had gone cold while they negotiated the terms of Richard's technological future. When Sarah walked away, she took with her not just her own expertise, but detailed knowledge of every major project Collins Industries had in development. Within a week, Justice Tech would know exactly what Richard's company was planning, giving Layla the information she needed to counter every move before he made it. The third target was personal. Rebecca Morrison had been Richard's assistant for 12 years. She knew his schedule, his business relationships, his personal habits, and his vulnerabilities better than anyone alive. She also had a daughter starting college in the fall, expensive private college that her single mother's salary couldn't quite cover. "Ms. Morrison," Layla said when Rebecca answered her private cell phone Wednesday evening. "I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from a mutual friend." "Ms. Johnson?" "From Justice Tech." Rebecca sounded surprised, but not displeased. "What can I do for you?" "I have a proposition that might interest you. Are you free for lunch tomorrow?" The restaurant Layla chose was upscale, but not ostentatious. The kind of place where successful women discuss serious business without drawing attention. Rebecca arrived looking professional but curious, the expression of someone who knew opportunity when it knocked. "I'll be direct," Layla said after they'd ordered. "I'm prepared to offer you a position as my executive assistant. 200,000 annually, full benefits, and a 50,000 signing bonus." Rebecca's fork paused halfway to her mouth. That's almost 3 times what I make now. You're worth 3 times what Collins Industries pays you. Richard has been taking advantage of her loyalty for years. It was true. Rebecca was brilliant, organized, and completely indispensable to Richard's daily operations. She deserved far better than the modest salary and limited advancement opportunities she'd accepted out of loyalty. "Why me?" Rebecca asked. "Because you understand high-level executive support better than anyone in the city. Because you're professional, discreet, and incredibly competent. And because I need someone who knows how corporate executives really operate." Rebecca studied Layla's face, looking for hidden motives. "This wouldn't have anything to do with your acquisition negotiations with Collins Industries. This has to do with recognizing talent and paying for it appropriately. Not technically a lie." Layla did respect Rebecca's abilities. The fact that hiring Richard's assistant would also give her inside access to his operations was just a convenient bonus. "I need 2 weeks' notice," Rebecca said finally. "Of course, professional courtesy is important." They shook hands over lunch, and Layla felt another piece of Richard's infrastructure crumble. Without Rebecca, he'd lose the organizational backbone that had kept his complex business operations running smoothly for over a decade. More importantly, Layla would gain access to insider information about Richard's decision-making process, stress levels, and personal vulnerabilities. Knowledge that would be invaluable in the battles to come. By Thursday, the financial and technology trades were buzzing with rumors about Collins Industries. Whispers about cash flow problems, key personnel departures, and aggressive competition from Justice Tech. Richard's stock price dropped 6% in 2 days. Whenever you ever want to fight only to realize you'd lost something more important? Share your experience with victory that felt like defeat. Friday afternoon, Layla's phone rang with the call she'd been expecting. "Layla." Richard's voice sounded exhausted, defeated. "We need to talk." "No, we don't. Please. 5 minutes. I know what you're doing, and I know why you're doing it. But this isn't just hurting me. It's hurting hundreds of employees who had nothing to do with what happened between us." The appeal to her conscience was well played. Richard knew her weakness for protecting innocent people. "You should have thought about that before you abandoned your family," she said. "You're right. I should have. But destroying my company won't bring your mother back, and it won't change what happened between us." "No," Layla agreed. "But it will make sure you never hurt anyone else the way you hurt us." Is that really what Monica would have wanted? Revenge that destroys people's livelihoods? The question hit harder than it should have. Her mother had been many things: strong, determined, fiercely protective, but she'd never been vindictive. Even at the end, dying from medical complications that Richard's abandonment had made infinitely worse, Monica had forgiven the man who'd left her to struggle alone. "Don't you dare use my mother's name," Layla said. "You lost the right to talk about her when you walked away." "I know. But she loved you more than anything in the world, and I don't think she'd want you to become someone consumed by hatred." "I'm not consumed by hatred. I'm motivated by justice. Are you? Or are you just hurting because I hurt you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Was this about justice for her mother, or was it about the personal betrayal of falling in love with her father? "Both," she said honestly, "and that's reason enough." Richard was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was soft with something that sounded like pride mixed with regret. "You're remarkable, you know that? Brilliant, fierce, absolutely unstoppable when you set your mind to something. Monica would be so proud of the woman you've become." "Stop. I'm proud of you too. Even as you're destroying everything I've built, I'm proud that my daughter grew up to be someone who fights for what she believes in." The words hit like a physical blow. For just a moment, Layla remembered the way his voice sounded when he told her she was beautiful, the way his hands felt when they held her, the way her heart had opened to him before she knew who he was. Then she remembered the DNA test results and felt sick all over again. "Goodbye, Richard," she said. "Layla, wait." But she'd already hung up. That evening, As she updated her war room with the week's victories, Layla tried to feel satisfied with her progress. Marcus Hendricks was pulling his investment. Sarah Chun was bringing Collins's technological secrets to Justice Tech. Rebecca Morrison would start providing insider intelligence on Monday. Richard's empire was cracking, just like she'd planned. So why did victory taste like ashes in her mouth? When Richard's biggest investor called to withdraw $500 million, citing concerns about leadership integrity, he finally understood. His daughter wasn't just angry, she was winning. But winning and healing weren't the same thing. And as Layla stared at her reflection in the window overlooking Manhattan, she wondered if destroying her father would actually give her the peace she was looking for, or just create new wounds that would never heal. Victory tastes like ashes when you realize destroying your enemy also means destroying the only connection you have left to your mother. 6 months of corporate warfare had reduced Richard Collins from billionaire to barely holding on. His board had voted him out. His investors had fled. His empire was crumbling piece by piece, exactly as Layla had promised it would. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt empty. Layla stood in her corner office overlooking Wall Street, watching the morning news report on Collins Industries' latest quarterly losses. The anchor called it one of the most dramatic corporate downfalls in recent history. Justice Tech's campaign had been devastatingly effective. Ms. Johnson, her assistant, knocked on the door. "The Times wants a statement about the Collins situation. Tell them no comment." Layla didn't turn from the window and cancel my afternoon meetings. She needed to go home, to the apartment in Brooklyn where everything started, where her mother's memory lived in every corner. Maybe there she could figure out why winning felt so much like losing. The subway ride to Brooklyn gave her time to think, something she'd been avoiding for weeks. Every victory against Richard felt hollow. Every business partner who abandoned him, every investor who pulled funding, every headline about his fall from grace, it all felt wrong somehow. Her mother's apartment building looked smaller than she remembered. The key still worked, even though she'd been avoiding this place since the confrontation with Richard. Some wounds were too fresh to examine. Monica's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it. Layla had hired people to pack up most of her mother's belongings, but this room stayed untouched. The jewelry box still sat on the dresser, along with a stack of letters Layla had never read. Letters that might explain why revenge felt like poison in her veins. She opened the first envelope with shaking hands. Her mother's familiar handwriting filled the pages. Letters Monica had never sent, thoughts she'd never shared, truths she'd kept hidden. "My dearest Layla," the first letter began, dated just 6 months before Monica's death. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you finally found the courage to look through my things. There are things about your father I never told you. Things I kept secret because I thought protecting you from the truth was more important than honoring his memory." Layla's hands shook as she continued reading. "Richard wasn't the monster I let you believe he was. He was young, scared, and overwhelmed by my illness. When the medical bills started mounting, when I got sicker and sicker, he didn't know how to handle it. He thought leaving would be easier than watching me die." The words blurred as tears filled Layla's eyes. "I let you hate him because it was easier than explaining that sometimes people leave not because they don't love you, but because they love you so much that staying would destroy them. Richard left because he couldn't bear to watch me suffer, not because he didn't care." Letter after letter revealed the same theme. Monica defending Richard, explaining his choices, expressing regret for the story she'd told their daughter. "He sends money every month," one letter revealed. "Has for 16 years. I've put it all in an account for your college education. He doesn't know you think he's dead. I've let him believe you hate him because I thought it was kinder than the truth." Layla sank onto her mother's bed, surrounded by letters that rewrote everything she believed about her family. "I hope someday you'll understand that love and forgiveness can coexist with disappointment and loss. Richard wasn't perfect, but he loved us both the best way he knew how. Can revenge ever really heal the wounds that created it? What happens when the story you've built your life on turns out to be only half true?" Share your thoughts in the comments below. The final letter was dated just 2 weeks before Monica's death. "Layla, my brilliant girl, You have your father's mind and my heart. Use both wisely. Don't let anger consume you the way illness consumed me. Richard made mistakes, but he's not evil. He's just human. Layla read every letter twice, then sat in the growing darkness of her mother's bedroom, trying to process what she'd learned. For 18 years, she'd carried anger like armor. It had motivated her, driven her, given purpose to her pain. Now that armor was cracking, and she didn't know what was underneath. Her phone buzzed. Text from her legal team. Collins Industries filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy today. We won. Won. The word felt like a joke. She destroyed the man her mother had loved. The man who'd been sending money for her education for 16 years. The man who'd made mistakes, but wasn't the monster she'd convinced herself he was. The man she'd fallen in love with before she knew who he was. Layla pressed her face into her mother's pillow, breathing in the faint scent of vanilla perfume that still lingered after 2 years. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper through the darkness. Sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when to stop fighting. But how do you stop a war you've already won? How do you take back words that can't be unsaid, actions that can't be undone? Her phone rang. Richard's number. He'd been calling for weeks, and she'd ignored every attempt at contact. Tonight, surrounded by her mother's letters and the weight of truth, she answered. Hello, Richard. Layla. His voice was rough, tired, older than she remembered. Thank you for taking my call. What do you want? To apologize. For everything. For leaving your mother. For not being there when you needed me. For complicating your life in ways you never deserved. The words she'd wanted to hear for months now felt like salt in fresh wounds. It's too late for apologies. I know, but I needed to say them anyway. Silence stretched between them, filled with everything they couldn't say. Richard, yes. Did you ever stop loving her? My mother. His breath caught audibly. Never. Not for a single day. Then why? Because I was 28 years old and watching the woman I loved die slowly, and I didn't know how to be strong enough for both of us. Because I was a coward who thought running away would hurt less than staying and failing. The honesty in his voice broke something inside her chest. She never stopped loving you either, Layla whispered. When someone you love asks you to forgive someone who hurt them, what do you choose? When letting go of anger means letting go of the story that made you who you are, how do you move forward? The letter, dated just weeks before Monica's death, contained words that stopped Layla's heart. I hope someday you'll understand that love and forgiveness can coexist with disappointment and loss. Sometimes the dead speak louder than the living, especially when they're calling for peace instead of war. The storage unit on the outskirts of Brooklyn contained the rest of Monica's life. Boxes Layla had been too heartbroken to go through after the funeral. But her mother's letters had mentioned things stored here, secrets that needed to see daylight. Layla found what she was looking for in the third box. A manila envelope marked for Layla when she's ready. Inside were bank statements going back 16 years. Regular deposits of $5,000 every month, all from accounts traced to Richard Collins. Money that had paid for her education, her apartment, her first business venture. Money she'd never known existed. Her mother had been right. Richard had never stopped taking care of them, even from a distance. But there was more. Photos hidden at the bottom of the box. Pictures of Richard and Monica that Layla had never seen. Young and happy, before illness and fear had torn them apart. Her father looked different in these photos. Relaxed, genuinely smiling, his arm around Monica like she was the most precious thing in his world. The last photo stopped her cold. Richard kneeling beside Monica's hospital bed, holding her hand while she slept. The timestamp showed it was taken just 3 days before Monica died. He'd been there. At the end, he'd been there. Layla's phone rang with trembling hands as she called the hospital where her mother had spent her final days. Yes, I remember, Mr. Collins, the nurse said when Layla identified herself. He visited your mother several times during her last week. Always late at night, after visiting hours. He'd sit with her for hours, just holding her hand. Why didn't anyone tell me? Your mother asked us not to. She said it would be too painful for both of you. Even at the end, Monica had been protecting them from each other. Layla drove to Richard's penthouse building, the same one where they'd made love 6 months ago. The doorman recognized her, but looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, miss. Mr. Collins doesn't live here anymore." "Where?" "He sold the penthouse last month. I believe he's staying in a hotel while he looked for something smaller." Smaller. The man who'd once owned half of Manhattan was living in a hotel. It took 3 hours and dozens of phone calls to track him down. The Marriott in Midtown, a nice hotel, but not the Four Seasons or Plaza where billionaires usually stayed. Richard Collins was learning to live like everyone else. She found him in the hotel bar, sitting alone at a corner table with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking. He'd lost weight, she noticed. His expensive suits had been replaced by simple clothes that looked like they came from department stores instead of Italian designers. "Hello, Richard." He looked up, and she saw the shock in his eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like hope. "Layla, I didn't expect. What are you doing here?" "I found her letters. All of them." His face went pale. "She kept letters? About you. About why you left. About the money you've been sending." She sat down across from him, placing the manila envelope on the table between them. "About how much she loved you, even after everything." Richard's hands shook as he reached for the envelope, then stopped. "I don't know if I can read them." "She forgave you, Richard. She understood why you left, and she forgave you." Tears filled his eyes. "She shouldn't have. I abandoned you both when you needed me most. You were 28 years old, watching someone you loved die, and you didn't know how to handle it." Layla repeated her mother's words. "That doesn't make you evil. It makes you human. I've regretted it every day for 18 years. I know, and I've spent 6 months destroying your life because I didn't know the whole story." Richard finally opened the envelope, reading Monica's words with tears streaming down his face. Layla watched him discover what she'd learned. That love could coexist with failure, that forgiveness didn't require forgetting, that sometimes the people we hurt the most are the ones who understand us best. "She was always the stronger one," he said finally, wiping his eyes. "I should have stayed and learned from her instead of running. She didn't want you to stay and watch her suffer. She told me that herself in the letters. What would your parents want you to do with the pain they couldn't heal? When someone you love chooses forgiveness over anger, do you follow their example?" "Layla," Richard said carefully, "what we did, what happened between us before you knew, was neither of our faults." She met his eyes directly. "We were both looking for something we lost. We found each other instead. But it was wrong. It was complicated. But it wasn't wrong to want connection, to want love. We just found it in the wrong place." They sat in silence, processing the weight of everything that had happened. The attraction that had confused them both. The love affair that had felt both forbidden and inevitable. The truth that had exploded their worlds. "I destroyed your company," Layla said quietly. "I destroyed our family first. You were just evening the score. Mom wouldn't want us to keep hurting each other. No, she'd want us to figure out how to be family. If that's even possible now." Layla reached across the table and took his hand. The touch that had once set her skin on fire now felt different. Protective, comforting, safe. "She left us an address," she said, pulling out the final letter. "Said it was where you really lived." Richard read the address and smiled through his tears. "Calvary Cemetery, where she's buried. She wanted us to meet there, together. Have you ever found peace in the last place you expected? When grief brings people together instead of tearing them apart. How do you choose to heal?" The final letter contained an address Layla didn't recognize and 7 words that changed everything. "This is where your father truly lives now." She found him not in his corporate tower, but kneeling at her mother's grave. The man who'd abandoned them both, now the only one left to mourn alongside her. Calvary Cemetery in Queens was quiet on Tuesday afternoons. Old trees provided shade for weathered headstones, and the distant sound of traffic reminded visitors that life continued beyond these peaceful grounds. Layla arrived first, parking her car near the section where her mother rested. She'd visited the grave only twice since the funeral. Once on Monica's birthday, once on the anniversary of her death. Both times had been too painful to stay long. Today felt different. Today, she wasn't coming alone. Monica's headstone was simple, gray granite with her name, dates, and the words beloved mother that Layla had chosen because she couldn't think of anything more true. Fresh flowers lay beside the stone, daisies that someone had placed there recently. I've been coming every Tuesday for 2 years. Layla turned to find Richard standing behind her, holding another bouquet of daisies. He looked older in the afternoon sunlight, grayer, but also somehow more solid, more real than the billionaire businessman she'd first met. She loved daisies, Layla said. I remembered. He knelt beside the headstone, placing the fresh flowers next to the ones from last week. I couldn't come to the funeral. I didn't think you'd want me there, but I've been coming every week since. Layla knelt beside him, her fingers tracing her mother's name carved into the stone. I didn't know. Your mother and I used to come here when we were young. Her grandmother is buried 3 rows over. Monica would bring daisies and tell me stories about growing up in Alabama, about her family, about the dreams she had for our future. What dreams? Richard smiled sadly. A house with a big backyard. 3 kids, maybe 4. A dog named something ridiculous like Mr. Whiskers. She wanted to teach high school and help kids who reminded her of herself. Smart but poor, ambitious but overlooked. She did teach. After you left, she went back to school and became a guidance counselor. I heard. I used to drive by her school sometimes just to see if I could catch a glimpse of her. Never did, but I heard she was beloved by her students. They knelt together in comfortable silence, both lost in memories of the woman who'd connected their lives. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dancing shadows across the grass. I have so many regrets, Richard said finally. She didn't want you to carry regrets. She wanted you to live. How do you live with choices that destroyed everything you cared about? Layla considered the question, thinking about her own choices over the past 6 months. The corporate warfare, the systematic destruction of everything Richard had built, the satisfaction that had turned to ashes in her mouth. I think you start by admitting you were wrong. Then you try to do better. Is that what you're doing? Trying to do better? I'm trying to understand what better looks like. For 18 years, I thought better meant success without compromise, achievement without mercy. But maybe better means something different. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wrapped box. I brought something for you. Something that was your mother's. Inside the box was a simple gold locket, tarnished with age, but beautiful in its simplicity. Layla recognized it from childhood. Her mother had worn it every day until the chemotherapy made her neck too sensitive for jewelry. She wanted you to have this when you turned 21, Richard said. But I didn't know how to give it to you without explaining why I had it. Layla opened the locket. On one side was a tiny photo of herself as a baby. On the other was a picture of Richard and Monica, young and happy and in love. She never stopped loving either of us, Richard said quietly. Even when we stopped loving ourselves. I stopped hating you, Layla admitted. Somewhere between reading her letters and watching you lose everything I'd built my life around destroying, I realized hatred was just grief wearing a disguise. What do we do now? How do we move forward when we've both done things that can't be undone? Layla fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of her mother's love settle against her heart. We honor her memory by being the family she wanted us to be. Is that possible? After everything, Mom used to say that family isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other again and again, even when it's hard. Richard's eyes filled with tears. I'd like to choose you, Layla, if you'll let me. Not like before, but as your father, if it's not too late for that. The words she'd wanted to hear her entire life, finally spoken by the man she'd spent months trying to destroy. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so heartbreaking. It's not too late, she said, reaching for his hand. It's never too late for family. They knelt together beside Monica's grave as the sun began to set. 2 broken people who'd found each other through pain and loss and the enduring power of love that transcends even death. Have you ever found peace in the last place you expected? When grief brings people together instead of tearing them apart. How do you choose to heal? As they stood together in the growing dusk, Richard whispered the words he'd never been able to say. I never stopped loving her. and I never stopped regretting walking away from you. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but sometimes it's the only way to build a future worth living. The community center in Bedford-Stuyvesant had seen better days. Paint peeled from the walls, the basketball court had more cracks than smooth surfaces, and the computers in the learning lab were older than some of the kids who used them. But it was perfect for what Layla and Richard had in mind. The Monica Johnson Foundation for Educational Equity. Layla read from the paperwork spread across the folding table they'd set up in the center's main room. Are you sure about the name? It's her legacy, Richard said, reviewing the legal documents their lawyers had prepared. She should be the one remembered. 3 months had passed since their reconciliation at Monica's grave. 3 months of careful conversations, shared memories, and the slow work of building a relationship that had never existed. It wasn't easy. How do you become a father and daughter when you've been lovers and enemies first? But they were trying, and Monica's memory was their guide. The initial funding will cover complete renovation of this facility. Richard explained to the small crowd of community leaders who'd gathered to hear their proposal. New computers, updated sports equipment, expanded after-school programs, and college preparation services. "Why here?" asked Mrs. Patterson, who'd run the community center for 20 years. "Why Bedford-Stewie?" Layla stood to answer. "Because this is where kids like my mother grew up. Smart, ambitious, full of potential, but limited by circumstances they didn't choose. This foundation will make sure potential isn't wasted because of zip codes or bank accounts." The program they designed was comprehensive: tutoring, mentorship, college counseling, career preparation, and something else that meant everything to both of them: family support services for kids dealing with chronic illness in their households. "We want to help families navigate medical crises without choosing between treatment and financial survival," Richard explained, his voice carefully steady. "No child should have to watch their parents suffer, because healthcare is treated like a luxury instead of a right." The words carried weight beyond their practical meaning. This was Richard's penance and Layla's purpose combined into something that honored Monica's memory while addressing the systemic failures that had defined their family's tragedy. "What's the catch?" asked Marcus, a local minister who'd seen too many well-meaning programs come and go. "Rich folks don't usually hand out millions without expecting something back." Layla and Richard exchanged glances. They'd expected this question and decided on honesty as their answer. "The catch is that we both need this more than you do," Layla said. "My father made mistakes that cost our family everything. I spent months making different mistakes that nearly cost us any chance at healing. This foundation is our way of making sure other families don't pay for the failures of people in power." "Your father," Mrs. Patterson looked between them with sharp eyes. "I thought your father was dead." "That's what I thought too. Turns out the truth is more complicated than the stories we tell ourselves." Richard stepped forward. "I walked away from my family 18 years ago when my wife got sick. I convinced myself it was for the best, but really I was just scared and selfish. My daughter grew up believing I was dead because that was easier than explaining why I chose business over love." The room was completely silent. These were people who understood family dysfunction, community breakdown, the ways that individual choices could ripple outward to hurt innocent people. "We can't change what we did to each other," Richard continued, "but we could try to keep other families from making the same mistakes. Is it possible to love someone and forgive them without forgetting what they did? How do you rebuild trust when it's been completely shattered?" The questions came fast after that, about funding, oversight, community input, long-term sustainability. Richard and Layla had answers for everything. They'd spent months planning, consulting experts, learning from other successful programs. But the real test came from Destiny, a 17-year-old whose sharp intelligence reminded Layla of herself at that age. "What makes you think you understand what we need?" Destiny asked. "You got money, education, opportunities. What makes you think you know anything about our lives?" Layla met the girl's challenging gaze directly. "Because I used to live 6 blocks from here. Because my mother worked 2 jobs to pay for medicine that should have been covered by basic insurance. Because I know what it's like to be smart and angry and tired of watching the people you love suffer while rich folks get richer. But you made it out. I got lucky." And I got help from people who saw potential where others saw problems. This foundation is about making sure luck isn't required and help is available when it's needed. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, they had provisional approval from the community board and a waiting list of families who wanted to participate in their pilot programs. As they packed up their materials, Mrs. Patterson approached them with knowing eyes. "You two have been through something difficult," she said quietly. "I can see it in how careful you are with each other, how you both try so hard to do right when you've clearly done wrong before. Is it that obvious?" Layla asked. "Honey, I've been working with broken families for 30 years. I know what healing looks like, and I know what guilt looks like. You both carrying heavy loads. We're trying to put them down," Richard said. "Good. But remember, forgiveness is a choice you make every day, not a destination you reach once. Some days it'll be easy. Some days it'll feel impossible. What matters is that you keep choosing it." As they walked to their cars in the evening light, Layla felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the brittle satisfaction of professional success, but the deep contentment that comes from purpose aligned with values. "Thank you," she said to Richard as they reached her car. "For what?" "For letting me take the lead in there. For not trying to be the hero or the boss. For being my partner instead of my father figure." Richard smiled, the first genuinely relaxed smile she'd seen from him since their world had imploded. "Monica would be proud of you, of what you're building. She'd be proud of us, for figuring out how to be family without destroying each other in the process. When someone you've hurt offers you a chance to do better, what do you choose? When forgiveness is offered not as a gift, but as a challenge, how do you prove you're worthy of it?" 6 months later, as Richard walked Layla down the aisle toward the man she'd chosen to marry, she whispered words that healed them both. "I'm glad you're here, Dad. Some stories don't end with perfect love. They end with perfect understanding, which turns out to be worth even more." The church was small, intimate, filled with the people who mattered most to Layla and David. Community leaders from Bedford Stewie, classmates from Johns Hopkins, colleagues from Justice Tech, and volunteers from the Monica Johnson Foundation. But the man walking her down the aisle was the one who made her mother's presence feel real. Richard had asked for nothing. Not to give her away, not to make a speech, not even to be acknowledged as her father publicly. After everything they'd been through, he'd learned that love sometimes meant stepping back instead of stepping forward. Layla had insisted. "She looks just like Monica did on our wedding day," Richard whispered as they paused at the back of the church, waiting for the processional music to begin. "Tell me about that day," Layla said, adjusting her simple white dress, the same style her mother had worn, according to the photographs they'd found. She was nervous, kept checking her makeup in every reflective surface. But when the music started and she saw me waiting at the altar, she got this smile, like she'd just figured out the answer to a question that had been bothering her for years. What question? Whether love was real or just something people convinced themselves to believe in. The music began. Brahms, at Layla's request, the same piece her parents had chosen 28 years earlier. Richard offered his arm, and together they walked toward the altar where David waited. David Chun was everything Richard wasn't. Patient, steady, completely unimpressed by wealth or power. He was a social worker who'd met Layla through the foundation, a man who understood that healing took time and that love sometimes required rebuilding from the ground up. "Take care of her," Richard whispered as he placed Layla's hand in David's. "I will," David promised, understanding that he was accepting responsibility not just for Layla's future, but for honoring her complicated past. The ceremony was simple, meaningful, free of the ostentation that might have defined Layla's wedding if she'd married for business instead of love. The vows they'd written themselves spoke of partnership, growth, choosing each other daily despite flaws and fears. But it was the moment after the ceremony, during the reception in the church hall, that brought everything full circle. "Ladies and gentlemen," Layla said, standing to address their guests, "I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate with David and me. But before we eat, dance, and embarrass ourselves with speeches, there's someone I need to acknowledge." She looked directly at Richard, who sat at a table with foundation volunteers, trying to blend into the background. 18 months ago, I thought my father was dead. I'd built my entire identity around being the daughter of a man who died too young, tragically, heroically. It was a good story. Clean, simple, wrong but simple. The reception hall grew quiet. This wasn't the speech anyone had expected. The truth is messy, eh? My father didn't die in a car accident. He walked away from our family when my mother got sick because he was young and scared and didn't know how to watch someone he loved suffer. Richard's face had gone pale, but Layla continued. For months after I learned the truth, I hated him. I systematically destroyed his business, his reputation, his life. I convinced myself it was justice, but really it was just pain looking for a target. Layla, David said quietly, you don't have to. Yes, I do. She turned back to their guests. Because the most important thing I've learned this year is that love and forgiveness aren't rewards for perfect behavior. They're choices we make despite imperfect behavior. She walked over to Richard's table and held out her hand. My father made terrible choices 18 years ago. I made terrible choices 18 months ago. But we've both learned that mistakes don't have to be permanent if you're willing to do the work of making them right. Richard stood, taking her offered hand with tears in his eyes. The Monica Johnson Foundation exists because my parents loved each other imperfectly but completely. Because my mother chose forgiveness over bitterness. Because my father chose service over self-pity. And because I learned that the best way to honor someone's memory is to become the person they believed you could be. What's more powerful? Passionate love that burns out or family love that endures through everything? What happens when the most beautiful endings aren't about getting what you wanted, but understanding what you actually needed? The applause was subdued, thoughtful. These were people who understood complex families, difficult choices, the long road between pain and healing. So please, Layla continued, join me in welcoming my father, Richard Collins, back into our family. Not because he deserves it, but because love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing. The toast that followed was simple. To Monica Johnson, who taught us that family isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. Later, as the reception wound down and guests began to leave, Richard found Layla on the church steps, still in her wedding dress, but barefoot now, her shoes abandoned somewhere inside. Thank you, he said, sitting beside her, for what you said in there. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. Mom would have wanted everyone to know that redemption is possible, even when it seems impossible. Are you happy? Richard asked, watching David inside the hall, helping elderly volunteers clean up. Really happy? I'm complete, Layla said thoughtfully. For the first time in my life, I feel complete. I have a partner who sees my flaws and chooses me anyway. I have work that honors my mother's memory. And I have a father who's learning to love without conditions. I'm still learning, Richard admitted. Some days I still want to fix everything, control everything, protect you from anything that might hurt you. And some days I still want to punish you for the years we lost. But we're both learning that healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about building something better in the present. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over Brooklyn. Tomorrow, Layla and David would leave for their honeymoon. Next week, Richard would move to the small apartment he'd bought near the foundation. Next month, they'd break ground on 3 new community centers. But tonight, they were simply a father and daughter who'd found each other through loss and chosen each other through love. She would be proud, Richard said quietly. She would be amazed, Layla corrected. Mom always believed in happy endings, but I don't think even she imagined we'd figure out how to be family after everything we put each other through. If this story taught you something about forgiveness, family, or the complicated nature of love, share it with someone who needs to know that healing is possible even from the most twisted circumstances. And remember, sometimes the most beautiful endings aren't about getting what you wanted, but about understanding what you actually needed. As the last guest left the church and David approached to drive his new wife home, Layla turned to Richard one final time. I love you, Dad. The words they both needed to hear, finally spoken without shame or confusion or the weight of their complicated history. I love you too, daughter. I always have. And in that moment, Monica's voice seemed to whisper through the evening breeze. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about romance at all. Sometimes they're about family, broken, rebuilt, and choosing each other again and again until love becomes stronger than the mistakes that once seemed to define it. The empire Richard had built had crumbled. The one he and Layla built together would last forever.